This is Lipitor.
Lipitor.
Lipitor. Lipitor.
Lipitor.
Lipitor.
It belongs to a class of drugs called statins. They lower people's cholesterol and lower their risk of cardiovascular disease. The market for statins exploded in the late 1990s, but Lipitor was by far the most profitable, generating over $13 billion in revenue in 2007 and over $170 billion lifetime as of 2026. And those kinds of sales numbers are only possible because millions of people, like me, have taken statins. That's what I was curious about. How and why did statins get so popular? So for this video, I wanted to learn about how the first statins came to market, then how the market for statins grew so big in the 90s, and finally, how brand name Lipitor became such a juggernaut. Our story starts in Japan, with a little boy playing with mushrooms. When Akira Endo was a kid, his grandfather got him interested in science and medicine, which turned into a fascination with fungi and mushrooms. So when it was time for college, Endo went to a school of agriculture. And while he was there, he read the story of Alexander Fleming, the Scottish scientist who found the antibiotic properties of the penicillium mold and penicillin in 1928. In the years since Fleming's discovery, molds had led to all kinds of antibiotics like tetracyclines and streptomycin. And lots of traditional Japanese medicines were based on molds and fungi too, so Endo was interested in the idea that molds could make medicine. After college, Endo got a job at a Tokyo-based pharma company called Senkyo, where he followed his curiosity, and it paid off. He found an enzyme in a mold that helped fix a type of wine contamination. But the success with that enzyme earned him a sabbatical, which came at the right time. He was starting to get interested in other areas of science anyway, so in 1965, Endo got a job at a medical college in New York studying bacterial cell walls. And while he was in the US, he noticed something that changed his career forever. American food is ridiculous. The portions were insane, the recipes were more rich, and it was available for relatively cheap everywhere. At the same time, he noticed ambulances carrying obese elderly people off to the hospital all the time, probably because of heart attacks, he thought. And that wasn't an unfair assumption. Heart disease hit its peak mortality rate in the United States in the mid-1960s when Endo was in New York. See, after World War I, Americans started experiencing more cardiovascular disease than ever before. And by the 1960s, doctors were just starting to get on board with the idea that high levels of cholesterol in the blood might cause atherosclerosis, a stiffening of the arteries thanks to a buildup of cholesterol-laden plaques. If these plaques got too big or if the blockage ruptures, they can lead to heart attacks or strokes. Now, there was still plenty of debate about the role of cholesterol in heart disease, and the hypothesis would become more nuanced over the next few years, especially the role of diet. But as far as how it impacts the timeline of our story, the cholesterol hypothesis was strong enough that drug companies had started selling a few cholesterol-lowering medicines by the mid-1950s. Like the Merrill company found a drug called triperenol that lowered cholesterol levels in the blood. Merrill got approval in 1959 and sold it as MER29 starting the following year. But after it came out, reports popped up about some side effects like vomiting and vision loss. Eventually, the FDA learned that Merrill hadn't disclosed everything they knew about triperenol's adverse effects and made them take it off the market in 1962. The other big class of cholesterol-lowering drugs were called fibrates. Although for a long time, the only one on the market was clofibrate from Imperial Chemical Industries in the UK. The fibrates showed some modest cholesterol-lowering effects throughout the 60s, but they had adverse reactions of their own, like an increased risk of gallstones. Akira Endo would have been familiar with the state of the cholesterol research and the landscape of cholesterol drugs. So after working in the US, Endo came back to a job at Senkyo in 1968, where they let him pick his own research project. And this is where everything in his life story comes together. He thought that he might be able to find a chemical in molds or fungi that could inhibit the formation of cholesterol in the body. Endo hypothesized that since some fungi had antibacterial properties, other fungi might make compounds that naturally inhibited cholesterol production, maybe like a natural antibiotic. So he started looking. Starting in 1971, he and his team sourced thousands of different molds, then cultured them in broth and screened the chemicals the molds created. Then they isolated compounds from the molds and tested whether the chemical could inhibit cholesterol formation. Repeat that times a couple thousand. Their first hit was a chemical called citrinin. It inhibited cholesterol formation in rats, but it was fairly toxic, so they didn't take it any further. But after 2 years and north of 6,000 tests, they found another hopeful candidate. Endo had gone into a store and found a bag of rice tainted with a bluish-green mold that turned out to be a type of penicillium mold, Penicillium citrinium. If you've seen my penicillin video, you'll notice some parallels to that story too. The most potent strain of penicillin came from a moldy cantaloupe found at a market in Illinois. This moldy rice was Endo's personal penicillin moment. Just substitute cantaloupe for rice. From this mold, they isolated a compound codenamed ML236B in 1973. But they had a big problem. When they started preclinical trials in rats in 1974, they couldn't get the drug to lower cholesterol levels. And while that would usually kill a project dead, Sankyo let Endo continue research and try the drug on other animals. And when they did, they found that it did inhibit cholesterol synthesis in hens, in dogs, and later in monkeys. And that must have been a huge relief for Endo and the team. All those years of work would have been wasted if they cut that project after the rodent studies. Sankyo patented the compound in 1974. By the time they published a paper in 1976, they had a good idea of how ML-236B lowered cholesterol. See, the cholesterol in our body is a lipoprotein. It's a lipid attached to a protein. Most of the cholesterol in our body is a chunky molecule called low-density lipoprotein, or LDL. This is the stuff that forms the plaque in atherosclerosis, which leads to heart disease. But there's also a smaller version called high-density lipoprotein, or HDL. And this version shepherds cholesterol from the blood back to the liver. You'll often hear them called bad cholesterol and good cholesterol, respectively. Your liver makes most of the cholesterol in your body while the rest comes from diet. Then your body uses it for your cells, your brain, and to make molecules like hormones. Cholesterol has a function in normal physiology. It's not 100% bad. Endo's cholesterol-lowering compound affects how the body makes cholesterol, its biosynthesis. And its mechanism of action was simple, but impactful. See, when your liver makes cholesterol, your body needs a chemical called HMG-CoA. Then an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase comes along and binds to it, which turns it into a new compound called mevalonate. Then, after a few more transformation, it turns into cholesterol. Endo's drug has a similar shape to HMG-CoA, and that structure allows the drug to bind to HMG-CoA reductase, which keeps the enzyme from binding to actual HMG-CoA and catalyzing it into mevalonate. So by inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase, there's less mevalonate, which means less cholesterol synthesis in the liver, and thus less cholesterol in the blood. The whole point of this drug was that it inhibited that one enzyme, because that reductase enzyme is the bottleneck of the whole process. It's what's called a rate-limiting enzyme. It's kind of like how a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. A chemical process is only as fast as its slowest step. And by making the slowest step even slower, you slow down the whole process. ML-236B lowered cholesterol production, but it didn't stop there. Because to compensate for its new low cholesterol levels, the liver pulls cholesterol in from the blood, which lowers cholesterol levels further. The Sankyo researchers published some results in 1976, at which point an American pharma company called Merck invited Endo to give a lecture at their headquarters in New Jersey. A month later, researchers from the company asked Sankyo for samples of the drug and any data they'd be willing to share. Understanding that everything would stay confidential, Sankyo gave them samples of ML-236B and some of their experimental data. Coincidentally, the same year the Japanese researchers published that article about their drug, an English pharma company isolated a chemically identical compound from a different mold. It came from Penicillium brevicompactum, so they called it compactin. As a result, though, lots of people called Sankyo's molecule compactin too, although drug developers tended to call Sankyo's molecule mevastatin, a reference to the mevalonate in the cholesterol synthesis process. Either way, by 1978, Endo was ready to test mevastatin in humans. The first participant was an 18-year-old woman with genetically acquired high cholesterol in the blood. It's called heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. We'll see this condition a lot in this video. People with HFH have cholesterol that's way higher than normal, which gives them a much higher risk of heart attacks early in life. They potentially had a lot to gain if Endo's drug did lower cholesterol. And within a few days of taking the drug, the young woman's cholesterol was down 30%. But she also experienced a muscle wasting that seemed kind of like muscular dystrophy. Luckily, that went away when she was taken off the drug. The researchers later came back and lowered the dose, and this time she didn't get those side effects. With those results, Sankyo opened up a formal clinical trial in 1979, this time recruiting folks with the condition from throughout Japan. In the end, Sankyo saw a good safety profile at a lower dose of the drug and an average cholesterol drop of 27% at the higher doses. At this point, Endo's cholesterol project had spanned 10 years and finally looked like it might result in a commercialized drug. At the same time, it was becoming clear that existing cholesterol drugs weren't enough for all the patients out there. At the end of the 70s, start of the 80s, the World Health Organization started publishing results from a large study that followed men who had taken clofibrate, one of those older cholesterol-lowering medications. Unfortunately, at best, the fibrates only decreased the risk of non-fatal heart attacks and only in people who didn't already have heart disease. And at worst, clofibrate led to an increase in overall mortality in certain men, so the WHO concluded it wasn't appropriate to recommend the drug at the population level. And since then, doctors have learned that fibrates have some dangerous drug-drug interactions with statins. So, talk to your doctors. As a result, Clofibrate got less popular throughout the early 80s, and Sankyo's mevestatin was starting to look like a better alternative for preventing heart disease. There was a lot of potential. And this got other pharmaceutical companies interested in looking at molds and finding their own statins, the term for HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. The first to get good signal was Merck, the American pharma company who'd borrowed that sample of mevestatin a few years earlier. They started a screening program in October of 1978 and found a good candidate just 2 weeks later. The new compound had a nearly identical structure to Sankyo's mevestatin and inhibited the same enzyme. In their 1980 paper, the Merck scientists called it mevinolin and later lovastatin. By the end of 1978, Endo left Sankyo and got a professor job at a university in Tokyo where he kept researching statins. In February of 1979, he isolated another statin that he called monocolin K. He filed a patent for it in March and licensed it to Sankyo. But here's the twist. In fall of 1979, they learned that monocolin was chemically identical to Merck's lovastatin, even though they came from different fungi. So how's that going to work when everybody patents everything in pharma? Well, Merck discovered the molecule first, in October of 78, but they didn't patent it until 4 months after Endo patented his. This would be relevant if either drug ever hit the market. Some companies would award patent priority to Sankyo and others to Merck, which prevented the other company from selling their product in the nation where the patent was held. It was like a little turf war. Your country either had Merck statins or Sankyo statins. Merck moved lovastatin into clinical testing in April of 1980, but then, all of a sudden, Sankyo stopped their statin research. They'd conducted some toxicity tests in dogs, basically seeing how big of a dose would be lethal for a certain number of the subjects. And at these super high doses, they noticed a link with a certain type of cancer. The dosages would have been an unattainably high dose for a human to ever take, like hundreds of times higher. But Sankyo still deemed it too risky and put the brakes on mevestatin. Or at least that was the rumor. And rumor or not, Merck kind of freaked out. Sankyo wouldn't have stopped their research unless they found something terrible, right? And lovastatin was so similar to mevestatin that whatever was going on with Sankyo might happen with their drug. Adding to their anxiety, Merck had only done short studies. When they put dogs on lovastatin for longer amounts of time, maybe they would see the same cancers. At the same time, they'd put millions of dollars into this research, and if they stopped now, they'd miss out on profits. I know, world's smallest violin for the big pharmaceutical company. Still, they had a decision to make. So in September of 1980, Merck called off their statin research, which is bananas. Assuming FDA approval, they would have been the first statin on the US market and brought in buckets of money. But they took it seriously. They recalled all the existing lovastatin samples, told the FDA, and had doctors screen experiment participants for cancer. Luckily, nobody showed signs of any. The whole episode must have been terrifying for everyone involved. But statin research kept going. In 1981, researchers at Kanazawa University in Japan showed that mevestatin was really good at lowering LDL cholesterol in patients with familial hypercholesterolemia, that inherited condition I mentioned earlier. So after halting research, the head of Merck Research Labs flew out to Japan to work out a collaboration with Sankyo. He proposed that Merck and Sankyo should figure out the tumor thing together, release lovastatin to the market, then Sankyo could release a new and improved statin in the future. Sankyo was not interested, which meant that Merck had a dilemma. Thanks to the rumors of tumors, their drug was high risk without a super clear reward. The connection between cholesterol and heart disease wasn't as well established as it is today, so Merck switched strategies. They decided to target folks with the same condition that Endo did his trials on too, heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. There still weren't any drugs to treat the condition, so the risk-reward calculation was easier to justify. Folks with this condition face an early death if they didn't lower their cholesterol. So in July of 1982, Merck asked the FDA if they could move forward with clinical trials specifically for patients with this type of high blood cholesterol. By then, word about lovastatin had gotten out there, and a few doctors in Oregon and Texas had asked for the drug for their high-risk patients. According to FDA historian Dr. Suzanne Junod, the FDA would allow trials to continue, but under a special arrangement. Merck would have to share all of their data with the Oregon and Texas doctors who were granted INDs, which is kind of like a form that allows them to use an experimental drug. By November of 1983, the special trials had seen positive results and Merck started their own clinical trials again. In March of 1984, Merck submitted their own IND, and by November of 1986, had enough data to file a new drug application. Which means that after years of holding their breath thanks to rumors years earlier, they finally had data saying that lovastatin was safe long-term in dogs and dramatically lowered cholesterol. They earned FDA approval in 1987 for the treatment of high blood cholesterol not controlled by diet and exercise. Merck sold it as Mevacor. But now that Mevacor was on the market, would doctors actually use it? And if so, how big would statins actually get? The Sankyo scientists weren't done with statins. They found that when they gave dogs mevestatin, the dogs metabolized it into a useful statin they called pravastatin. As you can see, they have pretty similar structures except for that side chain. They didn't begin trials with pravastatin until 1984, but from that point, it was a pretty straightforward clinical trial story. By 1989, the medicine was ready for sale in Japan, and Sankyo started looking for co-marketing partners to help them launch the drug around the world. They landed on a deal with Bristol Myers Squibb, who would market the drug in the US starting in 1991 under the brand name Pravachol. Meanwhile, Merck was dealing with the weird international patent situation between them and Sankyo still, so they were eager to patent a new statin and sell it in new markets. So they came up with a modified version of lovastatin that they called simvastatin. Basically, lovastatin with another methyl group, but it was much more potent in rat models. Merck released it as Zocor in the US in 1992. But these drugs weren't super cheap. For reference, Merck's lovastatin cost $1.64 for one 20 milligram pill back in the 80s. And you were expected to take the drug for the rest of your life, so the cost adds up. To differentiate themselves a little bit, a Swiss company called Sandoz AG, now part of Novartis, took a different strategy. They came out with a drug called fluvastatin, which they sold as Lescol. While they weren't the most potent statin, they marketed Lescol as the lowest price statin. So by the early 90s, we've got 4 statins. They're getting more popular, and studies kept showing that statins could lower elevated LDL cholesterol. But that didn't automatically mean that statins protect against atherosclerosis or heart disease. To show that, a company would need to conduct a prospective, randomized control trial where some people got statins and some didn't. That company was Merck, and that study was called the Scandinavian Simvastatin Survival Study, or 4S study. This one changed a lot of people's perspective on statins, so it's worth taking a look at how the trial was designed. Merck wanted to know how well simvastatin would lower LDL cholesterol and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease compared to a placebo. So they recruited over 4,000 Scandinavian men with heart disease and followed them for over 5 years on average. And the results were strong. Up to that point, some of the best cholesterol-lowering drugs reduced total cholesterol by about 10% and heart attacks by around 20%. In the 4S study, statins lowered cholesterol around 25%, LDL by 35%, risk of strokes by 30%, risk of non-fatal heart attacks by 34%, and risk of dying from heart attacks by about 42%. But 42% compared to what? Let's take a look at that last number. In the 4S study, 189 of the 2,223 participants in the placebo group experienced fatal heart attacks, while 111 out of the 2,221 participants who took simvastatin died from heart attacks in the same time frame. That's an absolute risk rate of 8.5% in the placebo group and 5% in the statin group. 8.5 minus 5 is an absolute risk reduction of 3.5%, which doesn't sound like that much. Absolute risk is useful for predicting what someone's risk of an outcome would be. But if we wanted to focus on the effects of the drug itself, like they did in the 4S study, it can be more appropriate to focus on something called relative risk. For the 4S study, the scientists divided the event rate from the statin group, 5%, by the placebo group, 8.5%, for 58%. That's the relative risk. The statin group had 58% the rate of fatal heart attacks compared to the placebo group. Relative risk reduction is just 100% minus the new RR, so 100 minus 58 is 42%. That's where the headline comes from. That's how the 4S study could claim a 42% reduction in heart attacks from simvastatin. This study, as well as more large cohort prospective studies, came out throughout the 90s and got a lot of people to care about statins. Like, the whole point of reducing cholesterol was to reduce risk of heart disease, and this was good evidence that statins did both. On a bit of a personal note, I was prescribed my statin when I was 35, which I felt kind of weird about at first. Like, my family's history of heart disease isn't great, but I was young, I exercise almost every day, I don't smoke, I shouldn't need a statin, right? But statins have been so well studied that by the time I was prescribed one in 2024, there were multiple meta-analyses showing how safe and beneficial it would be. This isn't medical advice, this is just what helped me adhere to my doctor's advice. Now, of course, people on statins can still get heart attacks, and that's because atherosclerosis has multiple causes beyond cholesterol, like smoking, lack of exercise, blood pressure, and diabetes. So it's not the only risk factor, but cholesterol is a big one. And of course, there are some potential side effects like rhabdomyolysis, muscle pain, and issues with liver enzymes. Luckily, serious rhabdo is rare, but muscle pains are more frequent. I found stats saying anywhere from 5 to 29% of statin users experience muscle pain, and it can get bad enough that people discontinue the drug. But cardiologists these days agree that when used appropriately, the benefits of statins outweigh the risk. Once again, not medical advice, go talk to your doctors. Getting back to the timeline. The Lancet published results from the 4S study in 1994, and statins exploded in popularity. Merck's statins broke the billion-dollar revenue threshold for the first time the following year, and by 1996, all the statins together earned about $4 billion and helped Merck become the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world. Still, given the prevalence of high cholesterol, there was a bigger market available and thus room for more companies to enter. A small chunk of a big pie is still a big chunk of pie. In fact, the pie had grown so big that 3 of those statins hit blockbuster status in 1997. That means they hit $1 billion in annual revenue. By January of that year, Zocor, or simvastatin, had 32% of the American cholesterol-lowering drug market. Pravachol, or pravastatin, had 21%, the old Mevacor, lovastatin, and new but low-cost Lescol, or fluvastatin, had 14% each. The remaining percentage includes all the non-statin cholesterol-lowering drugs like the fibrates. But later in 1997, the 5th statin would enter the market and make the incumbent drugs look small by comparison. But to understand how they did it, we need a little more backstory. Let's rewind to 1970. A company called Warner Lambert acquired an American drug company called Parke-Davis, who, until recently, had been the biggest drug company in the entire world. They came out with Benadryl, which was the first antihistamine in the US, were some of the first to conduct pharmacology research, and one of the first to quality control their drugs. They also employed lots of women during World War II. Parke-Davis was initially in acquisition talks with Revlon, the cosmetics and hygiene company, but went with Warner Lambert instead. At that point, Warner Lambert was mostly a consumer products company famous for Listerine and Hall's cough drops. But after the acquisition, they decided they'd focus more on pharmaceuticals. Before the WHO released their report that made fibrates less popular, Parke-Davis synthesized a fibrate of their own called gemfibrozil. It was FDA approved in 1981, and they released it under the name Lopid to denote how it lowers lipids. You know, real subtle stuff. But they were aware that Merck and Sankyo were working on drugs that lowered cholesterol through a new mechanism, so in 1982, Parke-Davis started looking for a statin of their own. Unlike the existing statin candidates, which started as chemicals found in nature, the Parke-Davis chemists decided to synthesize their statins from scratch. One of their junior chemists, Bruce Rifath, started with a structure called pyrrole. Why did he do that? I love this. Just because he knew how. He'd worked with pyrrole in grad school and decided to try it out. I mean, if all you've got is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail, I guess. But none of the pyrrole compounds were more potent than existing lovastatin. Some seemed like they'd work, but ended up being too toxic in rats. So in mid-1985, the Parke-Davis scientists pivoted and started testing compounds based on different central rings. And by June, they had 2 main candidates ready for preclinical testing. One based on pyrrole, the other based on pyrazole. And in trials, they both lowered cholesterol in rabbits, but the team decided to advance the pyrazole-based compound to clinical testing. But then in the spring of 1986, they got devastating news. That Swiss company that came out with fluvastatin, Sandoz AG, had a patent which would prevent Parke-Davis from developing a statin based on pyrazole. After learning that, Parke-Davis pivoted back to Roth's pyrrole-based statin. They tweaked it some more before advancing it to testing in April of 1987, but only about 3% of the drug got to the bloodstream when it was given via capsule. It wasn't very bioavailable. So they tweaked the molecule again, but it still wasn't much better than the competition. They might get approval off this, but given the data they had, doctors wouldn't have a reason to prescribe their drug over the competition. So they took one of Roth's older drugs, what they called atorvastatin, and tried making different salts of the drug, eventually arriving at atorvastatin calcium. But they still needed to show it offered some benefit over the competition. Because at this point, it was the early 1990s, and the statin market was getting competitive. Merck's lovastatin was selling well, and simvastatin and pravastatin were in the approval process. Meanwhile, Sandoz from Switzerland and Rhone Poulenc from France had statins in the pipeline as well. But like I said, a small slice of a growing pie is still a lot of pie. Parke-Davis calculated that as long as they could enter the market, they could still make hundreds of millions of dollars. So they brought atorvastatin to preclinical testing, and it wasn't spectacular. It lowered triglycerides a little bit in guinea pigs and dogs, but it didn't lower cholesterol any better than lovastatin. Still, unless they started over, this was their best bet at having a statin of their own. So in early 1990, they got investigational new drug status, their IND, which allowed them to perform human trials. First up, phase 1 trials. The goal here is to assess safety on a small number of participants. So Parke-Davis recruited 24 healthy male Parke-Davis employees from their Ann Arbor, Michigan location. They started the volunteers on a single small dose, then did follow-on trials where they tried bigger daily doses. None of the participants showed signs of toxicity at the lower doses, but once they got to the real big doses, like 120 milligrams a day, they saw some adverse effects on the liver. Easy enough, Parke-Davis would set the upper limit lower than that. Now they had to test it over the course of weeks, and when they did, they confirmed it was safe and at least as effective as the other statins at the lower levels. At the upper levels though, like 80 milligrams, it was really effective at lowering LDL cholesterol. The next up were phase 2 trials. These are meant to look at the drug's safety and efficacy in a small number of patients that have the disease the drug is trying to treat. So the scientists recruited dozens of patients across the US, observed them for 8 weeks without giving them atorvastatin, then randomly assigned them to take either a placebo or a dose of the drug ranging from 2.5 milligrams to 80 milligrams for 6 weeks. In the end, they saw a dose-dependent effect on cholesterol, meaning that higher doses lowered cholesterol more effectively. One of those phase 2 trials was published in 1994 and provided the first hints that atorvastatin might actually be more potent than some of the other statins. It's the second time in this video that there was a disconnect between animal trials and human trials. This is when it started to click for Parke-Davis that atorvastatin might be a big deal, even if it seemed underwhelming in animals. And the timing couldn't have been better, because in 1994, the 4S study came out, which made any statin more exciting. And this motivated Parke-Davis to hit 2 goals. Number 1, get their drug to market quickly while statins were having their moment. 2, provide their sales team with data showing that atorvastatin lowered LDL cholesterol better than everyone else. The first challenge was getting to market. Regular FDA approval would take about 12 months, and while expedited FDA approval was possible, they would need to show that atorvastatin treated a, quote, unmet medical need. So they essentially copied Merck's playbook with familial hypercholesterolemia. They recruited 2 doctors in South Africa and showed that atorvastatin could lower cholesterol in patients who didn't respond much to simvastatin. It was enough for priority review from the FDA. They submitted their new drug application to the FDA in June of 1996. And while they waited for the FDA's decision, Warner Lambert, the company who owned Parke-Davis, had to tackle another problem. They'd be competing with some well-established players, and doctors were already familiar with the old statins. Unless Lambert could show them how great their statin was, physicians wouldn't have a reason to switch from the old ones. Plus, Merck's Mevacor was scheduled to go generic in 2001, which meant that cheaper statins were about to flood the market and bring down the price of brand name statins. So they had to get as many sales as possible in a limited time window. Also, I'm aware how gross this all sounds from the patient's perspective. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the drug companies. From Warner Lambert's perspective, there were millions of patients ready for their first statin prescription. They just needed the sales force to get them. And really, that meant getting the physicians. This all happened right before direct-to-consumer marketing was allowed on television, which I'll talk about shortly. So to expand their reach, they decided to partner with a company who had a larger sales team. And in the fall of 1996, that led them to sign with Pfizer. By the mid-90s, Pfizer was a top 10 big pharma, but not an overpowered juggernaut by any means. They had a few blockbusters in their portfolio, like a COX-2 inhibitor called Celebrex, an antidepressant called Zoloft, and Zyrtec for allergies, among others. But what made them an attractive partner for Warner Lambert was their sales team. Pfizer recently brought on a new chairman who hired a bunch more sales reps while the rest of the industry was downsizing. Pfizer and Warner Lambert agreed that Pfizer would pay over $200 million up front, and they would split certain marketing costs as well as the cost of clinical trials. In exchange, Pfizer got to sell atorvastatin and split the profits with Warner Lambert for 5 years. Also written into the deal, Pfizer was prohibited from trying to buy Warner Lambert for 5 years. I wonder why that's going to be relevant. This is Chekhov's acquisition clause. Parke-Davis got FDA approval in December 1996, just 6 months after it submitted its documents. Warner Lambert and Pfizer sold it as Lipitor, a name that combined lipid with atorvastatin. And as expected, their biggest marketing challenge was differentiating their drug from the competition. So Lipitor's sales team needed to communicate all that clinical data and show how Lipitor lowered LDL cholesterol and triglycerides more potently than other statins. Plus, the other companies weren't sitting still. The existing statin companies launched counter campaigns, and Merck hired hundreds more salespeople to push Zocor. BMS published a thing saying that Lipitor hadn't been shown to lower the risk of heart attacks, just that it had lowered cholesterol, which of course was meant to sow doubt. So Parke-Davis and Pfizer designed trials to compare their drug with everyone else's. In one of their more famous studies, they recruited over 500 patients and divided them into 15 different groups. Each group was assigned to take one of the 4 statins on the market at a specific dose for 8 weeks. This became known as the curves study, since the curves on a graph that it created showed, dose for dose, that atorvastatin lowered LDL cholesterol more than its competitors. Pfizer and Warner Lambert started winning over physicians with a different message too: convenience. With other statins, doctors would prescribe a low dose, take a blood draw to see if it worked, then bump up the dosage if it didn't. But the majority of patients on atorvastatin got to their goal cholesterol levels on the lowest 10 milligram dose first try. As a final selling point, Lipitor sold at a lower price than the others. A little more expensive than Lescol, but cheaper than Zocor and Pravachol. Then, once the drug was on the market, Pfizer delivered on their promise of a sales team. At its launch, the two companies sent out over 2,200 sales reps to spread the good word about Lipitor to over 90,000 physicians across the country. And it worked. Within its first year on the market, Lipitor hit that billion-dollar revenue blockbuster status and later became the leading statin with 30% market share of the new statin prescriptions. The drug was so successful so quickly that Warner Lambert had to buy a new drug-making facility so they could make more Lipitor pills. Between the aggressive sales team and the good clinical data, Lipitor took over as the world's best-selling statin, and soon the best-selling drug in the world, period. By 1999, Lipitor brought in $4 billion in annual revenue and claimed 46% market share. So in June of 1999, Pfizer and Warner Lambert agreed to extend their relationship for another 10 years and maybe even introduce some new Lipitor-like products. But on November 3rd of that year, Warner Lambert announced that they'd merged with American Home Products Corporation. American Home had just completed a merger with American Cyanamid, and this merger with Lambert would make them the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world by annual revenue. Mergers and acquisitions became a more important part of biopharma strategy throughout the 1990s, so this kind of deal wasn't unheard of. With so much pressure to add blockbuster products like Lipitor to their portfolios, companies needed to invest even more resources into research. And when a big company acquired a small company, they acquired their research staff and facilities, as well as any drugs they're developing. All of which helps the acquiring company get closer to releasing a blockbuster faster. Pfizer was not thrilled about this merger, since they'd probably lose their co-marketing deal if it went through. So on November 4th, the day after the news came out, Pfizer announced a $72 billion bid to acquire Warner Lambert. That amount of money is really hard to say no to if you're Warner Lambert. American Home countered with a new offer closer to $70 billion. Pfizer countered that with $82.4 billion. Then later in November, Pfizer sued Warner Lambert for breach of contract, Warner Lambert sued them back, and they all spent the next few months in court. Okay, so why did Warner Lambert even entertain American Home's lower offer? Well, according to an article in the New York Times that came out a few months later, a merger with Pfizer meant that a lot of Warner Lambert executives wouldn't keep their positions, and Pfizer might sell off the consumer products part of their business, the side that owned Listerine. Pfizer raised their bid to $87 billion, which finally got Warner Lambert to cave in February of 2000. The merger was formally completed in June of 2000, making Pfizer the second biggest pharma company in the world at the time, right behind GlaxoSmithKline. My last video was all about them and the heartburn medicine that earned them that ranking, so go check it out. After all was said and done, Pfizer paid over $90 billion for Warner Lambert, making it the largest acquisition in the history of the pharmaceutical industry at that point. And while the main prize was the right to sell Lipitor, they also acquired thousands more sales reps, another 12,000 researchers, and the largest research budget in the world at $4.7 billion a year. The other potential acquirer, American Home, kept $1.8 billion in fees. They were promised a merger that would have made them a lot of money, so this was a nice consolation prize. Funnily enough, in 2002, American Home renamed their business and became Wyeth, only to be purchased in 2009 by Pfizer. It's kind of like how crabs have evolved multiple times throughout evolutionary history. Like everything in pharma just becomes Pfizer. Pfizer spent all this money with the promise that Lipitor sales would be worth it. But to help those sales, Pfizer would also need to advertise. The same year that Lipitor hit the market, the FDA changed the rules around pharmaceutical advertising in the US. I mean, technically they clarified the rules, but this is a topic for another video. In summary, in 1997, the FDA allowed drug companies to advertise prescription drugs directly to consumers on television as long as they told viewers where to get more information. This is when the "ask your doctor if Lipitor is right for you" language comes into ads. Pfizer already had a sales plan before this, but not doing TV ads would be a wasted opportunity. And even before Lipitor hit the market, Warner Lambert and Pfizer launched a cholesterol awareness campaign called Know Your Numbers. And over the years, Pfizer put out some good ads. Like, I found one where this middle-aged man walks up to the diving board of a pool, all the women are checking him out while stats about his health pops up, like how many push-ups he can do. But once he gets ready to dive in, his cholesterol number pops up, and he does his big belly flop. I like the message of this ad. Like, you can look physically fit, but you still need to keep your cholesterol in check. That's a fine message. But Lipitor's ads also got Pfizer in trouble. In 2006, Pfizer launched an ad campaign featuring a doctor named Robert Jarvik, who they credit as the inventor of the artificial heart back in the 80s, although that title is sometimes disputed. The ad introduces him and shows him rowing across a lake before he says, I take Lipitor instead of a generic. This is a reference to how their competitor, Zocor, went generic that year and became a less expensive alternative to Lipitor. According to an article in the AMA Journal of Ethics, it was, quote, the first well-known case of a physician serving as a celebrity sponsor for pharmaceutical promotion. The author of that article says that the more that bloggers learned about Jarvik, the shadier his story seemed. He did go to medical school, but he never completed residency, so he wasn't licensed to practice medicine or prescribe drugs in the US. And Jarvik later admitted that he didn't start taking Lipitor until he started working with Pfizer, which didn't look good either. The final nail in the coffin, though, was the rowing. The ad agency hired a body double for the rowing shots, which is kind of funny. As the AMA Ethics Journal points out, the whole point of the ad was to warn people about substitutes. And they substituted the guy with the authority to make that claim. Towards the end of 2007, a committee in Congress started using the ad as an example of misleading advertising and called Pfizer in to testify in early 2008. Pfizer stopped working with Jarvik shortly afterwards. But Jarvik's testimonial wasn't totally baseless. Comparison studies after Lipitor's approval showed that it was more potent than other statins on the market. One of the most popular of these studies compared pravastatin to atorvastatin in what became known as the Prove It study. The researchers also wanted to assess whether lower cholesterol, regardless of which drug caused it, reduced the risk of heart disease. So, they recruited over 4,000 men with acute coronary syndrome, gave them the highest approved dosages of each drug, and measured how well either drug reduced the risk of cardiovascular events. In the end, participants on Lipitor did better in almost every outcome. Fewer heart attacks, fewer bypasses, and fewer deaths. Ironically, this study was sponsored by BMS, the makers of pravastatin, which performed worse than Lipitor in this study. Now, a few more statins have come out since Lipitor. Like rosuvastatin, brand name Crestor, came out in 2003 and went with a similar marketing strategy to atorvastatin. They positioned themselves as the most potent statin available, a superstatin. And in 2006, a clinical trial showed that rosuvastatin could reduce a little bit of plaque buildup in the arteries, which differentiated it from the other statins. And finally, in 2009, a Japanese company got FDA approval for pitavastatin, brand name Livalo. It's not super popular in the US, which is why I probably butchered the name, but it does exist. Meanwhile, Lipitor was making so much money that generic manufacturers started cooking up generics before they were legally allowed to. Pharmaceutical companies take out a bunch of strategically timed patents that prevent other companies from copying their drug. The US is cool with this system because drug development is expensive, so patents give the inventors a legal monopoly and allow them to recoup their costs. I did a whole video explaining the history of this system. Go watch it. Pfizer's patent on atorvastatin was scheduled to expire in 2010, but had other secondary patents that could have legally prevented competitors from making atorvastatin until 2011. They also had patents on manufacturing processes that might extend the protection to 2016. But in 2003, the Indian generics manufacturer, Ranbaxy, challenged those patents. They argued that the secondary patents, the ones extending the patent's protection, were invalid in the US, UK, and a few other countries. As expected, Pfizer sued them and spent the next 5 years in court. But they eventually reached an agreement in 2008. Ranbaxy would have to wait until November 30th, 2011 to make generic atorvastatin. After that, though, they'd get their FDA approval and get the standard first-to-file incentives, which are exclusive rights to sell generic Lipitor for 6 months before other generic makers could start selling their own. So, after a few more years of multi-billion-dollar revenues, November of 2011 finally came around, and Ranbaxy started selling generic atorvastatin. That same year, though, a group of drug distributors and pharmacies sued Pfizer and Ranbaxy for collusion. They argued that they used the 2008 settlement to keep generic atorvastatin off the market as long as they could, so that customers would have to pay more for brand name Lipitor. They didn't reach an agreement until 2024, when Pfizer paid $93 million. The equivalent of less than 3 days of peak Lipitor sales. Speaking of sales, Lipitor generated a total of $131 billion in revenue through 2011, and it continues to generate billions every year, even with generic competition. It became the most profitable branded drug in history up to a point. Its record has since been surpassed by Humira and Keytruda, both of which are monoclonal antibodies. Lipitor's success was at least partly due to the growing market size for statins throughout the aughts. According to the CDC, about 16.3% of American adults over 40 took a prescription statin in 2003. By 2011, 23.2% took one. According to that same report, 42% of those statin users were on simvastatin, which had a generic, while about 20% were on atorvastatin, which was still patent protected. But then in 2013, two big cardiology groups recommended even lower cholesterol numbers and recommended treatment with statins if diet and exercise didn't work well enough. The most recent data I could find was published in 2023 and estimates that closer to a third of Americans are using a statin now. But as safe as they are and as well as they work, not every patient with high cholesterol responds to statins. So there is still a need for cholesterol-lowering drugs that work differently. In 2003, Merck and Schering-Plough, the inventors of Claritin, released a drug called ezetimibe, what they sold as Zetia. Unlike statins, which block the production of cholesterol, ezetimibe blocks cholesterol absorption in the small intestine. And while it lowers LDL on its own, it's more effective when combined with a statin. So in 2004, the FDA approved a combination of ezetimibe with simvastatin, which Merck sold as Vytorin. But in a big trial in 2008, Vytorin turned out not to slow down heart disease more effectively than simvastatin alone. It still lowered LDL cholesterol levels, but it didn't impact the disease any better than just the statin. So if it's more expensive and doesn't have an advantage over cheaper treatments, most doctors chose to just prescribe a statin instead. Sure enough, after the trial was published, American doctors wrote about half the Vytorin prescriptions they did before the study. The combination drug is still around today, but statins are more popular in the US. So wrapping up, I've been thinking about what I want to do with the conclusion section of these videos, and I think I'm going to call it Patrick's POV from now on. You can draw your own conclusions from the video. This is just what I'm thinking about after the story. So in my last video, I told the story of how a heartburn medicine called Tagamet introduced the blockbuster model to pharma. The story showed that if companies invest a ton of money into R&D, they might get $1 billion drug out of it, and if they got a big hit, that profit could sustain future research for years, but it's risky. They might turn up with nothing. And that still happens in a lot of cases today. A lot of research just goes nowhere. But this model comes with downsides too. Like in 2010 and 2011, a bunch of important blockbusters like Lipitor went generic. So all of a sudden, multiple pharmas were making billions of dollars less in revenue. And as a result, the industry had to lay off tens of thousands of employees in those years. But the blockbuster model is still the most popular model in biopharma today, so we'll see where it goes from here. Now, while reading up for this video, I came across some of the typical pushback and critiques of statins, but I expected that. What I didn't expect were the tons of people online that don't believe cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease. They're mainly the wellness influencer types, not like cardiologists, but I kept seeing them when studying for this video. So that inspired me to read about the history of cholesterol denialism from the late 19th century to today and how scientists learned that high cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease. The more I read, the more I realized I had to make a video about this. So I decided to turn that story into a separate video that you can watch on Nebula, an indie streaming service made by creators for creators. I post all my videos there early and ad-free, but Nebula is also home to hundreds of other creators, including some of your favorite in the health space like Chubby Emu and Midlife Crisis, and we're adding new folks all the time. Plus, we're always coming out with Nebula Originals, which are shows that you can only watch on Nebula. Like Jason from Not Just Bikes has a show called Day Pass, where he goes to a new city, gets a day pass for the local transit system, and explores the town. I've personally loved this one. It's gotten me in the mood for summer road trips. So if you want to check out Nebula, go to go.nebula.tv/Patrick Kelly to learn more. If you use my link, you'll get 50% off an annual subscription, which brings it to just $30 for a full year. Or you can get a lifetime subscription, which brings the cost from $500 down to $300 for life. That subscription directly supports my work, as well as the production of interesting new content. Again, that's go.nebula.tv/Patrick Kelly, or you can scan this QR code. Thanks for watching, y'all. Take care.